Hey guys, we finally made it. Crocodiles and birds. So excited. um, so we already talked through evolution of birds and crocs when we did the chapter 7. So we are going to jump straight into morphology with these guys. So again, just the evolutionary group we're talking about here are the archosaurs. They are the group that are the diapsid amniotes and the living relatives, extant groups, and those are crocodiles and birds. So we'll talk through both crocodiles and birds with each of these body systems and morphological traits. The book definitely seemed to have a leaning towards birds, so don't think I'm being overly biased. I give a tiny bit of lip service to crocodiles and then sort of go on and on about birds, which I sort of appreciated. So, skin of crocodiles. Crocodiles have heavily armored bodies. Each epidermal scale develops separately, so the scales don't really form a solid sheet. They tend to be gradually replaced. The dorsal armor formed by heavy plates of bone called osteoderms that are actually within the dermis. So important functions for protection, really no longer any function for respiration through the skin, but water loss and protection from outside elements. And bird feathers. So bird skin and bird feathers. I think we've mentioned before that feathers are modified scales and they are unique to birds. So they distinguish birds from all other animals. They come from keratinized stratum corneum portion of the dermis, and they have some more typical reptilian scales on their bodies as well. We generally see that at the base of the beak and also on the feet and legs of birds. So a typical feather consists of a central shaft with two main parts, a hollow cylindrical portion known as the calamus, which is we might refer to as the quill, and also a more solid squarish portion known as the rachis. So there's several small parallel branches known as barbs that collectively form the vein on each side of the rachis. And the barbs have smaller branches known as barbules, which have small little hooklets or hamuli that allow those barbules to zip together, almost like Velcro. And feathers are distinguished into 5 different types. We'll look at those in a second. Contour feathers, semi-plumed, flight feathers, downy feathers, bristles, and phyloplumes. And for the most part, feathers arrive from defined tracks on the body. There are only a few species of birds that tend to have feathers sort of distributed all over the body. Penguins and kiwis in New Zealand, ostriches have sort of random feathers, but other birds have feather tracks. We'll look at that as well. So here are 5 different types of feathers that we might see in birds. Pretty fascinating. We talked about evolution of feathers a little bit and evolution of flight in the last lecture, but recall that feathers are considered homologous with reptilian scales and are initially thought to have developed for thermoregulation, for warmth, and only secondarily to be used for flight. So flight feathers are highly adapted for flight. They include the feathers that we find on the wing of the bird, the primary and secondary feathers. They include feathers of the tail that we refer to as the rectrices. And we do generally have a set number of primaries and rectrices in birds in general. Contour feathers kind of form an outer contour on the body. They help to shed water and provide warmth. They are the feathers that birds actively preen to keep oiled and serve their protective functions. They can also be quite colorful. Semiplumes are similar to contour feathers, but more loosely webbed. They are found underneath the contour feathers in the body of the bird, and they in some birds really can fill out quite a bit of space. For instance, in waterfowl, they help to allow for buoyancy in water birds in general. Down feathers are small, fluffy feathers. They are beneath the contour feathers as well. Barbs do not interlock in down feathers, and their principal function is to provide insulation. We see veinless feathers that have only one shaft that we call bristles. These are normally found around the mouth, nostrils, and eyes of certain birds. We see them around the mouth of swifts and flycatchers, and they actually help to sort of steer and direct prey, trap prey, directing them towards the mouth. And then phyloplumes are hair-like feathers. They can be scattered over the skin between the contour feathers. They can serve as decorative or sensory. So, for example, the long, colorful feathers of peacocks are phyloplumes. And we see similar breeding plumes in all sorts of birds, but really beautiful ones in some of the wading birds that were once collected for ladies' hats. And this is a diagram from the book showing feather tracks. So these are the sort of defined tracks where we see feathers arising from on the body, and then areas that are naked, unfeathered. So feathers continuously wear down and are replaced periodically through the process of molting. Generally, molting occurs in a systematic way that allows birds to maintain enough flight feathers as to not lose their ability to fly during the molting season. And birds are some of the most colorful animals on the planet, and colors are produced by a variety of pigments and structures within the feather. Structural colors occur through reflection and refraction of the cells. They can produce beautiful metallic blues and greens, other iridescent colors. We see that kind of structural feather color in lots of birds, but you probably have noticed it in ravens and crows. Some other birds that appear black actually have quite a bit of structural color in their feathers. Owl feathers have long hair-like extensions on the barbules. It's an adaptation that allows for silent flight in owls. Being able to fly silently for owls gives them the advantage of maximizing their hearing while hunting for prey in the dark, and also silently approaching their prey to keep them unaware. Claws. All birds have claws on their feet, and this is an adaptation for perching, for capturing prey. And also, as I said, most birds have regular sort of reptilian scales on their feet. The diagram on the right demonstrates the growth of a feather, which is quite interesting and complex. There is a stage during the growth of feathers when feathers are highly vascularized. We refer to those as pin feathers. If a bird breaks a pin feather, they can actually bleed out. It can be fatal for birds to have either broken and bleeding pin feathers or infected pin feathers. Birds have a special gland on their skin that we call the uropygial gland. It secretes an oil of some semi-solid fats and vitamin D. And if you watch birds, when they're preening, you'll see that they touch the top of their tail and then move their beaks to sort of spread that oil across their feathers. So they're rubbing their beaks against the uropygial gland and then oiling the outside of their feathers to keep them in good condition. Skeletal system, just a few notes on skeletal system in crocodiles. Crocs possess a complete secondary palate, and that allows for air passage to be separated from the oral cavity. It's also worth noting that crocodile skulls are complete on top with a hinged jaw below, really allowing for some, we'll talk more about this with the muscular system, but some maximized force in closing the jaw, but not in opening it. Vertebrae in crocs consist of cervical, thoracic, lumbar, caudal. The ribs are curved and include cartilaginous uncinate processes. The overlap between the ribs, that overlap from those processes gives them more strength. And the sternum is present as well and consists of a plate to which the ribs attach. The legs of crocs are used for walking and can really move those large animals at impressive speeds across the ground. But when crocs are in the water, they sort of fold those stunted limbs into their bodies and use almost fish-like movement, lateral undulation in the tail in order to swim. Birds' skulls exhibit the diapsid reptile skull with a single occipital condyle, and they have an incomplete secondary palate. The brain is generally larger than in comparable reptiles of the same size. And they do have a specialized bony sclerotic ring that holds their really relatively enormous eyes. And you can see that in our next slide. We'll see a bird skeleton. Birds' beaks. Birds depend on their beaks for many things. Beaks are a hollow, toothless sheath, really, that are important for everything from preening their feathers to building their nest, for courtship displays, defending themselves. And the beak of a bird tells us a lot about its ecological role. Vertebra, similar in birds, we see cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, caudal vertebra that are connected to the sternum by the ribs. So bird skeletons have some really interesting fusions and adaptations that we'll talk through. Generally, the two sacral vertebrae are fused together with the last thoracic and the first few caudal, all of the lumbar, and they form a singular structure that we call the synsacrum. So you can see the synsacrum, just a sort of a large bony plate at the base of the bird before the tail. The synsacrum is also fused with the pelvic girdle, and it's a super important framework in birds. It creates a really rigid reinforcement. It helps them with the bipedal gait and also allows them landing gear, allows them to withstand the stress of landing from flight. There are usually also 10 to 15 caudal vertebrae present. That's the remnants of the reptilian tail. You can kind of see in this diagram that the last 4 to 7 caudal vertebrae are fused together to form what we call the pygostyle. Moving forward towards the ribs and the keeled sternum, ribs are fully outside, and as with crocodiles, they possess the uncinate processes. So you can see the little protrusions on the ribs that allow them to overlap. These are fully calcified in birds. And the sternum of birds that fly, as well as penguins, have a keel on them. So actually like a bony protrusion. Pay attention the next time you work with a rotisserie chicken and take a look at that keeled sternum. It's fascinating. It allows a place for the attachment of the tremendous flight muscles that we see on birds. Birds also have a furcula, which is another special feature. The clavicles are united at the midline. It's also what we call the wishbone, and it also allows for attachment of the flight muscles. Appendages in birds have been modified for flight. There are several other fusions that we see in the body and in these limbs, including the carpo metacarpus, the tibiotarsus, and the tarpometatarsus. All of these are sort of a rearrangement of the bones that we typically see in vertebrate limbs. We also see a high degree of specialization in the beak of birds that really reflects the various ecological roles that they play. And then we see similar specialization in the avian feet, including webbing of aquatic birds, lobing of shorebirds' feet, strong talon feet of raptors, the perching feet of our songbirds and other perching birds, or passerines. So we've got a figure I'll show you here in a sec that shows feet. One of the things I didn't mention just then actually is the bones themselves of birds are, we call them hollow bones, but they're actually filled with struts and reinforcements that make the skeleton very light, but hollow. So an adaptation for flight. So birds have lost the heavier marrow of their bones. A lot of the adaptations that we're seeing that allow for strength, the structure of the skeleton, are also allowing for reduction of weight, allowing for flight in these guys. Wanted you to see the singular upper jaw that's really fused into one bony structure, and then also the lower skeletal jaw of crocodiles. And then examples of birds' beaks related to their ecological role, and birds' feet. Now we're actually going to cut the lecture here, and we'll keep going.